What is up, guys? In this video, I'm going to be going over the two drift cars I think everybody should have in this game. Now, the main reason for this is these cars are going to be insanely good for people who are starting out and or trying to improve their overall drifting ability. So the first car is obviously going to be the Nissan 370Z. I love this thing. It also looks awesome. Probably one of my favorite drift cars in the game. Now, I do want to mention, by the way, I'm not calling all the other drift cars really bad in this class because honestly, some of them are going to be pretty dang good regardless. Now, if you guys do have a good build on them, most of the other vehicles could probably compete with the 370 and the 350Z pretty easily. But the biggest thing I notice about the Pro Drift and the Roadster is the fact that you do not have to adjust their settings at all, which I think is going to give these cars a huge advantage over the others. You can basically jump into one of these vehicles and pretty much just jump into any of the events and do really good on them. I was getting over 600,000 points on basically every single one I tested both cars on. Now, this is very important because you do not actually have to get a crazy high score to do good in the summits, and now having vehicles like the 350Z and the 370 I think are going to make these summits a lot more fun for many players, and luckily you can also get a lot better at drifting now, which I think a lot more people are going to really enjoy the drift class now having cars like the 350 and 370Z in the game, because if you guys are new to drifting, we can all agree this could be pretty dang difficult to get used to. For example, jumping into the Lamborghini here, trying to get this thing to actually drift could be a bit of a challenge. You could sit there messing with the settings on this car for hours on end trying to get it to drift, and even after all you do to it, it still won't do what you want it to do. Having a car like the 350 and or the 370 will give everybody an option to really get better at drifting, which I think is awesome. I, for one, been having a great time with these cars, and the best part is you can literally jump right into any event with these vehicles being completely stock and still get a really good score, and you can also learn throttle control and going around the turns correctly and being in the right gear. And then once you start getting more used to how the Nissans drive, then you can jump into something like the Ford Mustang GT, which is definitely a little bit harder to drive, and getting good settings on a car like that could be a bit of a challenge. But once you get better with those cars, then you can jump into something like the Mustang and really improve your skill even more. Now, I do think this is awesome having cars like this in a class because I know a lot of players are not big fans of the drift class. I know whenever they show up in a summit, a lot of people are like, oh man, we got to do a drift event now. Luckily, having something like the Nissans in the game, I think are going to make a lot more players into this a lot more. The Forsberg 370Z is honestly just incredible. I mean, the way this car can drift is mind-blowing. Like you guys see the footage in the background. You really don't have to do much of anything with the car except, staying in different gears if you are in manual. Then just trying to get around the turns at the right speed is pretty much all you have to do. Not having to adjust some of these vehicles for these events I think are going to make a big difference. I, for one, was in some of these events for a while with some of the other cars, and my goodness, it took so long to get them to turn, which can get frustrating really fast, but luckily we have cars like the Nissans now that are going to do really good. It kind of makes me laugh because even on some of the other drift vehicles, no matter what you actually do to them, they still do not feel all that great, which I do think is going to be a bit of a problem. But now we have the Forsberg Racing cars here in the drift class that I think will really help things a lot with a lot of players. And there's a lot of things I like about both vehicles. So for one, with the 370Z, I love how this car actually drives. The speed of it is crazy, the power it puts out. Plus, this thing also has incredible stability. Not only that, I also noticed the 370 is going to be really good if you guys are trying out manual. I noticed shifting through the gears on this vehicle in a lot of the events is actually really easy to do, and luckily the car doesn't have some weird like RPM issues like some of the other vehicles might face, unfortunately. This one's going to be really easy to be between like second and fourth gear on basically all the tracks, besides that new Forsberg one where I noticed you did have to jump into like fifth a couple of times. But luckily shifting through the gears is going to be really good for the throttle control, so you can definitely practice that a lot easier with something like the 370 instead of using like the MP412, which I do think that car would be a little bit harder to run. So having vehicles like this that are a lot more user friendly I think are going to be great. So that will basically make the Nissan 370Z one of the best overall drift cars in the game. Now, I'm not saying it's going to make the other cars useless because obviously the BMW Z4 and the RX-7 I still think are really great cars to use. I do love using the RX-7 still. I love how that car feels. But trying to get used to the handling on something like that and trying to adjust it to really drift good might take a little bit of time to get used to. But luckily having cars like the Nissan, which will make that a lot easier. Now, the other car that I was having a lot of fun with now, I know the Nissan 350Z is part of the motor pass, but I have to share this vehicle in here because all the Forsberg Racing vehicles so far in this update are honestly a blast to use and also really good compared to a lot of the other vehicles in the game as well. Now, obviously to get the 350Z, you guys will have to level up to 37 in the motor pass, and you will have to buy the motor pass to get this car, but to be honest, I highly recommend grabbing the Motor Pass just for the 350Z. This car is a really fun time. Not only does it handle very similar to the 370, but it might be a little bit slower, but I do think that's actually going to help it in some ways. I noticed when testing out the 350, the stability of this vehicle is honestly blowing my mind. The way it could fly around a turn with it and keep it in that turn and then shift down or shift up into an extra gear was honestly just crazy to me. This car really did not struggle at all in any way. I did notice some of the other drift vehicles to be kind of annoying to drive after driving the 350 because I wanted to jump into some of the other ones to see how they might compare, and I instantly wanted to go back to the Roadster because it was just that fun to use. I've always been into drifting a good amount in this game, and now that these vehicles have come out, I found myself jumping into these events even more. I've been having such a good time going in there and getting like 600k plus on each one. And the craziest part about it is you literally don't even have to try that hard with these cars. That's how good they actually are. And they're also really fun to use. Now, I really do think this will help a lot with getting better at drifting, because you literally have a couple of cars you can now just jump into and not have to adjust them, and they're also really fun to use. Now, I did mention before the 370 and the 350 are a bit different in some ways. Now, the biggest difference I notice is probably the power. I do know this car is going to be a little bit slower than the 370, which really isn't that big of a deal. I actually think it does benefit it in some way because you can get more stability out of the car and you won't like overfly around one of the turns or something like that, or overshift and go way too fast. So I do think that would be really good. And if you guys are learning to try to get better at drifting, this would probably be a really good vehicle to use. Now, I'm also planning on running like the RX-7 and or the Ford Mustang GT in the future a little bit more in summits, just to see how they really can compare to some of the better drift cars that are in the game now. I would say basically most of the drift cars could probably still do really good. We all know the top's probably going to be the Nissans and the RX-7, the BMW. I actually ran the GT in the recent summit, and it did a lot better than I thought. It's definitely a lot harder to drive than some of the other drift vehicles, which I do think a lot of players won't like it for that matter. But I also think it's going to be really fun to get used to some of the other vehicles, and now that we have a stepping stone with the Nissans, I think is going to make this a lot more fun in this game. Now, let me know what you guys think about both of the Forsberg Racing vehicles in the comments below. Have you guys been running these drift vehicles? What are some things you've noticed that are way better with them compared to the others? I really do want to know, because I think these cars are going to be a great addition to the drift class, and I've been really enjoying them a lot. I cannot believe how much I'm actually drifting on the Crew 2 now, because these cars just make it that much more fun.